Hello, my name's Peta Temple. I've got a diagnosis of emotionally unstable personality disorder and I'm a third-year student nurse. Now, if we really are the sum of our experiences, then those two identities very much combine to contribute to who I am and how I am in any given moment. Now, I've been really lucky along my journey. I've found people along the way who've motivated and encouraged me. They've cared for me and they've believed in me. But I've also experienced the stigma of this label, and I felt branded by the words on this t-shirt. I'm sure you've heard similar in your practice. So things like behavioural, team splitting, risky and manipulative. And to me these words are a way that we pass moral judgment on people rather than sharing a true clinical perspective on what's going on for them at the moment. And I'm not going to put on the t-shirt, and I really hope that what this presentation does is help you never give one of these t-shirts to one of the people that you're working with. The reason that I think that that's so important is because it's not just words, it's a framing of who we are as people, and frankly that's not okay. I'm sharing my story today to highlight why it's so important that we do choose our words with care. Care is, of course, the critical word in that. We're healthcare professionals. We're smart people and we can do better. And we as service users deserve better. Straight away though, if you look at my journey, you can really quickly see where those labels might come from. I was in services from 2010 till 2016, so straight away. Potentially treatment resistant, challenging, and all the behaviours that I was exhibiting at that time. So I was self-harming through drugs, alcohol, overdose, cutting, burning and setting fire to myself. Risky as an individual. I was the sort of person that my clinicians have since shared with me that they were worried that they would get a phone call one day and say that things had really not gone well for me. And what I think that that demonstrates is that when we struggle, that struggle manifests in a lot of different ways. And that reminds me of a quote by Friedrich Nietzsche, who said, "He who has a why to live can bear with almost any how." And if your how is cutting, burning and setting fire to yourself, then we as professionals really do owe it to those people that we're trying to help to hold a magnifying glass up to that why. Why are you still here? What's keeping you here? Why haven't you completed suicide yet? Let's look at your how. Is there anything more adaptive that we can put into there? Some more coping skills to make your life easier? Now, from 2012 to 2014, I had a fabulous evidence-based treatment for my set of difficulties in the form of dialectical behavioural therapy, and that was life-changing for me. But for 4 out of the 6 years that I was on caseload, I was being managed by people like yourselves in a whole range of different healthcare settings, and they didn't necessarily have the necessary therapeutic background to feel confident with the way that they were approaching me. We all know people who have come across that sort of thing and come up against people who are really challenging, and that's affected them in such a way that they've ended up going off sick themselves because they have suffered from stress. Now, I'm really open about my mental health journey because, as the government says, mental health really is everybody's business, and while that includes us as nurses, we can sometimes feel this pressure to be okay, to press on regardless, at the detriment of our own mental health. I think that that's why it's really important that we create spaces such as these where we can talk about that kind of thing. It's going to help us become more open about our own mental health experience, address stigma, secure better access to supervision. And it gives us a space to reflect on how our attitudes and experiences might impact our practice. Because it's not just them out there, it's us in here. The statistic runs that 1 in 4 people every year is going to experience some sort of mental health difficulty. And I would argue that probably that figure's higher amongst nurses. They're going through so much in their daily lives. So it really is unlikely then that I'm alone in the room. But that's a really good thing. Diamond says it's precisely this woundedness and not necessarily the fully healed psyche that intensifies the wounded healer's compassionate therapeutic powers. Other famous wounded healers, of course, include people like Pat Deegan from the US and Rufus May from over here. Both of those guys experience hearing voices. They've gone through the system, they've studied, they've become psychologists, and now they're really campaigning to promote more person-centred ways to conceptualise differences in experience. Marcia Linehan, of course, came up with DBT. I think she was initially diagnosed with schizophrenia. Certainly later in life she self-diagnosed as having a personality disorder. And it's her model I grew up in. And DBT is a very boundaried, very strictured model. It either is DBT or it isn't. But we don't live in a vacuum, and we certainly don't practice in one. And my journey has led me to create a far more integrative approach that borrows from a whole range of different ways to conceptualise this idea of helping. And of course, there's also a whole bunch of different ways that we could understand difference. Barker's tidal model, for example, the first developed by us and them, me and you, nurses and service users. So he certainly feels that input from people like myself is really going to help you in your practice. He writes about helping people reauthor their narratives, writing new stories about themselves, hopefully with happier endings. That's certainly something that I aspire to in my practice. Really love it. We're going to come back to it later. Throughout the course of the presentation, I'm also going to try and explain the psychodynamic means to understand difficulties in living. I'm not as well versed in that, but it makes sense to me, some of those things around transference. And despite my background in behavioural therapy, I'm going to make really very little apology for my bias towards those more humanist approaches, like Barker's, and also seen in Rogers' core conditions. And of course those core conditions are empathy, congruence, doing what you say you're going to do when you say you're going to do it, and unconditional positive regard. Because I think that if those are your building blocks, then it really matters little which model of therapy or helping that you use. And that's a statement that was borne out by the 2017 systematic review by Coy Chain et al. Now, as a student nurse, I'm throwing evidence at you. I should be very closely wedded to that evidence base. And this time last year, the consensus statement was released. And that model suggests that what we need to be doing is taking a stepped care approach to treating personality disorders. So the first step, low-level psychoeducation, that's your core interventions. That's this presentation. Moving up into skills groups like emotional coping skills, a derivative of DBT. And through into the evidence-based therapies. Here in Cornwall, we've got DBT that's available, we've got cognitive analytic therapy that's available. That particular document, the consensus statement, also suggests we look at things like schema-focused therapy and mentalisation-based therapy. Therapy's great, isn't it? We all love therapy. The problem is that not everybody can access it. And what that does is leave people like yourselves, managing people like myself, really high risk and without specific therapeutic training. So you might feel that you can't make much of a difference. If you are struggling to maintain therapeutic optimism, I think it's really important that you think back to this moment. It was people like you who gave me my life back. It was people like you without specific therapeutic training who made such a difference in the lives of not just me, but my children, my wider family. It's really big stuff. And it's really important to say thank you. Now, one of the themes in this presentation is engagement. I really believe that engagement is critical. If we look to policy, in 2003, the Department of Health launched No Longer a Diagnosis of Exclusion. That document highlighted the failure of mainstream mental health services to identify and provide appropriate treatment for those with personality disorder or other complex psychosocial disorders. The following year, in answer to that, 2004, they brought out Breaking the Cycle of Rejection, the Personality Disorder Capabilities Framework. And the answer, they suggested, was a major education and training initiative to improve the awareness, capability and competence of workforces across the health, social care and criminal justice systems. And I'm here today because both those documents suggest that we need to be including service users in training, service and policy development, because that's how we're going to break down this us and them divide, where you guys are all powerful and doing to instead of with people like myself, as is advocated in Barker's tidal model. Now, as I've said, I do struggle a bit with the psychodynamic approaches. I've read about transference and I found it really interesting when it comes to understanding why that t-shirt might be so powerful, why it might be so easy for us to reach for that when we're talking about how people are struggling. Now, my understanding is that if I bring my hypercritical, judgmental dad with me into all of our interactions, then perhaps in your early life you've got a drug addicted, alcoholic or otherwise difficult person that you're also bringing. It's not surprising then that we might ring each other's bells in ways that have got absolutely nothing to do with what's going on right here and now in the room between me and you. We're all just people. We all just bring our own stuff, our own values and beliefs into all of our interactions. You bring all your previous experience with all those t-shirts that you've met along your way. I bring mine, not just of my dad, but the other helpers that I've met along my way. And potentially that becomes a cycle where transference meets counter-transference, and around we go. And the thing is that we don't even have to say anything to one another to communicate these potentially negative biases. Only 7% of our communication is words. The rest is non-verbal and paraverbal cues. It's the tone of our voice, our inflection, our body language. It's our attitude. And attitude is critical when it comes to working with this group of people. If you're struggling to maintain a therapeutic relationship, some of that's going to leach out into those non-verbal and paraverbal cues, regardless of your intent. Now that's important because 40 to 76% of people with this diagnosis have got a history that includes some level of abuse. What that does to a person is it makes them hypervigilant. They've had to be to stay safe, to respond to the undercurrents in those early environments. They've become expert at picking up behavioural cues. So no matter how good you are as a nurse, those invalidating childhood environments might mean that we're expecting criticism. We go looking for it and thus we find it. Likely then we're going to behave in ways that make us difficult and less likeable. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. That can feed into all of your stuff and leave you thinking those t-shirts have got it right. It's another self-fulfilling prophecy. But if you can spot that cycle, then you're much more likely to be able to break it. And the fact is that you guys are far more skilled than the person that you're trying to help when it comes to trying to do that. So what tools might you find in order to find an exit to that cycle? An exit, of course, is a cognitive analytic therapy term. Exits for you guys might be reflection, might be supervision. It might be as simple as choosing to use Roger's unconditional positive regard or Barker's person-centeredness. A lot of these models have got words for concepts that are actually really similar. Now, CAT offers people like myself other exit strategies. Now, cognitive analytic therapy was developed by Ryle in the 1980s, great decade for personality disorder. Now, Ryle was a GP up in London, and he was working with a range of people, not just people with personality disorder, who needed some level of input. And what he wanted to create was a brief treatment, so 16 to 24 sessions, and he really wanted to help people understand how their thought patterns, how their behaviour patterns impacted on their quality of life. In the same decade, also 1980s, Marcia Linehan was over across the pond working on DBT. And of course here in 1983 we saw the Mental Health Act reform, which for the first time positioned personality disorder as treatable. Now this shifting of where the boundaries lie for personality disorder, Pickersgill described as a plastic rather than a durate concept. Really like those words. What he means is it's a social construct rather than a scientific fact. There's no clear line between normal and abnormal personality. And that's something that's quite topical at the moment because the chap who sat on the NICE guidelines, chaired the NICE guidelines for personality disorder and who also worked on the revision of personality disorder framing in the ICD-11, he's come out with something that he feels is quite groundbreaking. He says we're all on the spectrum. It's another spectrum disorder, and where you sit on that spectrum in any given day is going to vary. He also says that only 30% of people would have what he would describe as normal functioning personality. He also says he wouldn't want to sit next to any of that 30% during a dinner party. So, we've aligned personality disorder, rightly or wrongly, with the medical model. We know that medical means pills, it means hospitals. We also know we've got a wealth of evidence to suggest that hospitalisation doesn't work for this group of people. Medication isn't the most effective intervention for this group of people. Instead, it is the therapy that helps. But as I've said, that's difficult to access. So what we can be doing is working through some of this low-level therapeutic stuff with the people that we're trying to help. We don't need to necessarily have the training to offer a full service, but we can make a start. We can have some impact with that. One of the ways that you could do it is by drawing cat maps for people. So cat maps are visual representations of what's going on for them. Now Ryle talks about reciprocal roles. So there's a top level and a bottom level reciprocal role. So for me, my father sat in that dominant level. He was critical, he was judgmental. So I learnt how to be criticised, how it felt to be judged. Now I identified an exit to that in that I'm constantly striving, and sometimes that's a really great thing and sometimes it's really quite detrimental to me, and I have to be very aware of what's going on in order to keep that going in the right track for me. So you guys are probably quite used to being in that dominant role of being the helper, and I'm certainly more practiced at being helped. So today we're going to try and switch, find an exit where I get the chance to be the helper and you guys have a chance to be helped. Now another one of these tools that I found really, really useful, I still use it today, is to draw a graph of our emotional reactivity. Now you can throw all sorts of different theories at this, but it's really helpful for people. If you draw an axis along there, and that is asleep in the morning, you're going to wake up, spend your day, and go to sleep in the evening. This is 0, so 0 emotional reactivity. You're asleep or you're dead at this point. Hopefully you're just asleep. Going up to a 10. At 10 we're starting to see all of that autonomic response stuff coming in. Fight, flight, freeze. Somebody with a personality disorder, you're also seeing dissociation. We know what dissociation is. We've all done that. We've all left work, jumped in the car. Whose turn is it to pick up the kids? Was it tonight that they were going to Grandad's house? Got back to your driveway and thought, I don't even remember turning off the A30. That's great. If your early experience is an environment where there's violence, where there's aggression, the ability to be present and absent at the same time is really, really skillful stuff. The problem is that the behaviour persists long after that danger's passed. So what we want to be doing is trying to get in before people get up into this stage, because the behaviours that they're manifesting at that stage, it is suicidal attempts perhaps, certainly suicidal ideation, it might be self-harm, it might be, it might be that they're starting to exhibit other behaviours, so drug taking, overdoses, inappropriate sexual liaisons at that stage. Let's start with you guys, hopefully you don't get up that far. So you might wake up in the morning, here at about a 3, you go into the shower, you're waking up a little bit more, you go into the kitchen, husband or partner's drunk all the milk. Can't have a cup of tea before you go to work, calamity. Fortunately, you guys are really skillful. You've got all of these brilliant techniques to help you regulate and bring that back down again. It might be that you stop on the way to work and grab a Costa and think, oh, that was a nice treat. You might be playing your music really loud, singing all the way to work. Whatever it is that works for you. You get to work though and your boss says, you're late. That coffee's cost you time. You're back up again. Fortunately, you're going to get some informal supervision, you're going to have a moan to your friends, and you're going to be able to bring it back down again. And your day is going to go up and down like that in direct response to emotional triggers. Somebody with a personality disorder is very different. We start higher, irrespective of an initial trigger. We go higher. And because we don't have those skills, we stay high for longer. It takes us much, much longer to start coming back down again. Now, the way to use this graph is to talk to people. So when you were at a 6 or a 7, what stopped that from becoming an 8? Chuck solutions focus stuff at it. What stopped you from going a little bit higher? You've been an 8 before with other stuff that seems like it was more impactful. How did you manage to regulate your emotional experience? How did you manage to be so skillful to keep it at that level? What stopped it from becoming a 6? Or from what progressed it from a 6 to a 7? Was there anything else that we could have put in there? If you want to throw cat at it, you'd be talking about, okay, so let's talk about your reciprocal roles in that stage. What was going on for you? What behavioural patterns were happening in that moment? What exits could you have used for it? If you're thinking about exits at this stage of self-harm, of suicidal ideation, what could we do that's more helpful around that? And repetition is really great with these graphs. When people start to build up, okay, so last week I did this and that happened, and this week this happened, And I did that and something different happened. That's where the magic is. That's where you make changes for people's behaviour. The graph itself comes from DBT. DBT would be chucking distress tolerance skills at this. It would be chucking emotional regulation skills at this. And it would be chucking mindfulness at this. I think that the main thing is that the best thing that we can give to people is the ability to be aware of what they're doing and what drives that behaviour. And I think if you can do that, then it's a real gift for people, because if they've got that information, then they can choose to make different choices. They can choose to get different results for themselves. Now, the reason that talks like this are so important is because, as no longer a diagnosis of exclusion recognised, people with these sorts of difficulties have been largely failed by a healthcare system that often creates the stuff it's trying to cure. We could call that iatrogenic harm, of course. And if you consider hospitalisation, 40% of inpatient populations, according to Challen in 2004, have got a diagnosis of BPD. Yet Linehan sees it as interfering with effective treatment and is only willing to tolerate an overnight hospital stay. Livesley advises keeping it to a rarity, and Dawson and Macmillan suggest it should almost never be used for somebody with a personality disorder. That's fine. But how else are we going to manage those really chronic high-risk behaviours? How are you going to go to sleep at night knowing that you've left somebody in the community that's cutting, burning and setting fire to themselves? It's really difficult to balance that evidence that hospital doesn't necessarily work against our values, which have to be to keep people safe. And in order to have that two-footed approach with one in each camp, we might start by developing our understanding. Now, if I am an expert by experience, it's probably appropriate that I share some of that with you today. So I'm going to tell you 3 short stories. The first one happened one morning. I'd self-harmed in quite a bad way for me. I'd made a cut that was about 7 to 10 centimetres long on my forearm, and I'd gone through the skin, through the adipose tissue, into the meat of my arm below, and I'd cut like a blood vessel, bleeding pretty well. Now, on this particular morning, I happened to have a meeting with the nurse down at my local GP's office. Now, that is a great service. If you're working with somebody who's self-harming, get them linked up to those nurses down there. They can go through a programme that helps with self-management, harm minimisation, can talk about wound care, risk minimisation, can give free steri strips and wound pads. And what that does is it just slightly starts to shift that narrative, doesn't it? From one that's really punitive and self-punishing to one where you're starting to take responsibility for the choices that you're making, that I was making with my body. It was a really critical intervention for me, but on this particular morning, less skillful. So I wasn't prepared. I thought I was going to finish that cut. I thought it needed a bit more work on it. So I stuffed my sleeve with tissue paper and I turned up down at the local GP's and I showed her my other arm. And she looked at it and she said, "Fabulous, Miss Temple, this is all healing really well. It's coming together really nicely." She went through the intervention that she was going to do that day, and just as I was getting ready to leave, she said, "Well, I've got you here. Can I just have a look at your other arm?" Of course, the arm's come out, blood everywhere, and quite rightly, she sent me up to West Cornwall Hospital to get some stitches. Now, the lesson here is actually exactly the same as is in Helen Lee Savage's new I Cared and Shared suicide prevention training. And that lesson is always ask, have you done anything else to hurt yourself today? Now, Helen gives a really fabulous example of a nurse turning up to somebody's house, banging on the door, no response. So she sort of looks in the window and she sees a noose hanging in the hallway. Panic. So she's banging really hard. Now, unfortunately, the guy comes to the door. So she bustles in there. She says, "Let me make you a cup of tea, let's have a chat." And they sit down and they have a beautiful person-centred chat. She negotiates to take that noose away. She rushes back to the office. She updates the guy's risk. She phones the home treatment team. She informs her manager. She does a really great piece of work. But as that guy is waving her off at the door, he thinks to himself, "God, that nurse was lovely. She was so kind. Really wish that I could have told her I took 3 boxes of paracetamol before she got here." So always ask, have you done anything else to hurt yourself today? So off I went to West Cornwall. And I got there and sat down, and the doctor looked at my arm and he looked me straight in the eye and he said, "I don't waste anaesthetic on people like you." And he called over somebody else, a trainee doctor, and he said, "These people like pain, so I give it to them." Now I sat there silent and uncomplaining while that guy stitched me up, tears streaming down my face. I didn't say a word. The euphoria and adrenaline that goes with self-harm and largely protects us from a lot of that pain, had worn off by that stage. Just hurt. Now people self-harm for a whole range of different reasons, and my reasons would not be the same as the next 6 people that you spoke to. However, I would guess that not one of those 6 people would say that pain that you give to yourself forms the same function as pain that somebody else gives to you, whether that's emotional or physical pain. What he did that day was an abuse, and it was an abuse of his power and of me as an individual. But it's really unsurprising that I didn't complain. The Francis report tells us that even people with, air quotes, legitimate physical illnesses, even their well relatives and friends with great interpersonal effectiveness skills, really struggle to complain in the face of substandard healthcare. Now I went home and I took out every single one of those stitches, because if they were representative of the care that was on offer at that stage, then I really didn't feel that I deserved it. Now, of course, his approach was devastating, but today it gives us a really great way to discuss the fact that that's not the way to validate somebody's distress. Now, it was that experience that made me so committed today to helping educate healthcare professionals to do better with people with this diagnosis. Now, conversely, I was at a service user meeting recently by the Bridge Collective, which is a really fabulous service users group up in Exeter, and if you're interested in the service user movement, then they are the guys to look at. They're doing some fabulous work. And this lady came in and shared her story with us, and she was really generous in letting me pass it on to you guys today. And as she was telling her story, her body language changed. So she said, this day I'd made a big self-harm on my side, and it was so deep that I'd lost the razor blade within myself, and her shoulders have come up and her head's gone down, and she's had a shame reaction to this. And she described the fact that she was going to have to get medical attention for it. She knew that. So she turned up to the hospital and she said, I'm very sorry, I've done this to myself, and I'm really sorry, I'm going to need your help. Now, that lady got the same consistent message from the person who clerked her in, right through to the surgeon who eventually performed the operation to find and remove that razor blade for her. And that message was that she was just as deserving of care as would have been somebody who had arrived there following a road traffic accident. And I always get more emotional at that story than my own, because it's just so beautiful. For her, that happened 6 years ago, and she hasn't self-harmed since. Now, I'm not saying that you're going to solve it all with kindness, with Roger's empathy, congruence and unconditional positive regard. But isn't it interesting how powerful the stories are that we tell about ourselves and about other people? That's why I see our role as being to help people reauthor their narratives, to help them build resilience and hope. Okay, so the second story. On this occasion, I was in rehab. And rehab's very happy-clappy. It's about doing the next right thing. It's about joining in, being part of it. And on this particular morning, the joining in that they wanted me to do was a physical exercise class. Now, I was a lot thinner then. I was just coming off drugs. Still, though, I couldn't do it. Found it really, really difficult. Just said, I'm really struggling here, guys. And they said, look, I think this is a behavioural rather than a physical problem. You're actually kind of team splitting here because you don't want to do it. Mary doesn't want to do it now, and John doesn't want to do it. You're 2 weeks away from completing this rehab. If you want to continue with this programme, you're going to have to do this class. So I struggled through it. I did it. It was a physical thing. I got home 2 weeks later. About a week after that, I had a stroke. Now, before they could treat that stroke, they had to give me 2 blood transfusions. And they had to do that because to deal with the emotional of being in rehab, I'd been bloodletting quite significantly. Nobody was asking me those questions. Ad Action was commissioned for my mental health. That was the part of me that they were looking to help. At that stage, and I believe that their practice has changed significantly since then, but at that stage, my CPN wasn't invited in to come and see me and check how my mental health was going. It was a very compartmentalised healthcare system that we had. And what I hope that we're going to do through presentations, through this, through campaigning, through you guys working really hard out there, is to create a more joined up service where that sort of thing doesn't happen anymore. Because if we can do that, then we're going to allow people to take that full, whole person, holistic, biopsychosocial approach to health that we all know we should be working towards. So the message is ask. If somebody's self-harming or cutting, don't be afraid to ask those questions about when, where, how much, how long, how deep. Really get to the bottom of it and get a physical done. People with personality disorder live 18 to 19 years less than the average person. And a big contributor to that is the fact that they're not getting their physical health needs taken care of. Now, it's also worth saying, I had that stroke on a Thursday night. I had this funny turn and thought, if that happens again, better tell somebody. I'd noticed that things weren't quite right. I couldn't roll a cigarette. I'd been smoking since my teens. That should have been something that was quite easy for me to do. I was tipping a cup of water in the kitchen and I can remember thinking, I used to tell my arm to move. I can't right that cup. Then my mum came round on the Saturday. As I said, it had happened on the Thursday. World was very small. Didn't have any interaction with anybody in the intervening time. One of the first things she said to me was, Pete, are you drunk? I said, no, Mum, it's 10 o'clock in the morning. I'm not drunk. What I think's happened is I think I've had a stroke. And when I said it, I knew that it was true. There was a genuine problem. It wasn't just all in my head. But by that stage, I totally bought into that narrative that I was manipulative, attention-seeking, probably just making it all up. Even I didn't believe my own inner voice anymore by that stage. Now, I did get great help from services. DBT almost unquestionably saved my life by teaching me new ways of being, doing, thinking that led me out of that really dark place that I found myself in. But just because I felt as if things were improving, that doesn't mean that the diagnosis magically disappears. Personality disorder is a really sticky label. Once you've got it on you, it's really hard to take it off again. My first year of being a student nurse, I was doing fabulously. I was getting great marks. I'd made loads of friends. I hadn't had friends for years. I hadn't had friends for about 10 years. It's a huge, huge thing for me. I had been told by my lecturers that my lived experience was going to make me more empathetic as a practitioner. It was going to really serve me in my practice. Basically, I was on fire at that stage. However, first placements got released. My first placement was down at Belitho, the CMHT that had been looking after me during my most ill times. So I was going to be working alongside my psychiatrist, one of my old CPNs who had seen me in that stage of cutting, burning, setting fire to myself. They'd been round to my house during that time. They'd seen me at my very worst. And I wasn't entirely sure how they were going to react to me being on their side of the table at this stage. I was nervous. I thought what would be skillful would be to go to the GPs and get a prescription for some beta blockers. A DBT ninja would probably say radically accept that. They would probably say sit with it, practice your mindfulness. But I wasn't that skillful at that stage. I'd certainly aspire to be there. I'm not sure that I'm there yet. I went in there. I used my dear man. So that's describe, express, assert, reinforce, mindfully, not aggressive, negotiate. I did all of that stuff. And he went, yes, you can have the prescription. Awesome. But as he was writing that prescription, he said, now, this is a grown-up medicine. I'm going to have to trust you to be a good girl. Because if you make an attempt on this, it will actually kill you. Now, for him, that was probably ticking a box of risk. For him, that was probably just, yep, right, told her that, out she goes. For me, I walked into that room a student nurse on fire. And I walked out a PD. Worse than that, I walked out a PD likely to make an attention-seeking overdose. So remember, when you think it's only a word, it's just between us staff. Words are just 7% of our communication, but wow, how powerful they are when we use them to frame somebody else's difficulties. When we use them to frame somebody else's sense of self and who they are as a person. That's why, as professionals, we're obligated to choose them with such care. Because when we author stories about somebody, our words can become their own. So choose yours with kindness and use them to instil hope. Now, what I hope I've conveyed so far is that attention can be exactly the right sort of medicine for this group of people. Sadly, what we might not be doing is asking for the right sort of it at the right time and in the most skillful of ways. So we, as service providers, need to be asking those questions. A recent audit I did for the home treatment team found that just 6 people on caseload over a period of 3 months took a combined 44 overdoses that they didn't report to a soul until I phoned them up and said, "So have you taken any overdoses that you haven't reported?" One girl I spoke to said, "Take about 3 or 4 a week." I said, "Oh, when was the last time you took one?" She said, "Oh, yesterday, I think, just before I saw my CPN." "Did you tell her?" She said, "No." I said, "Do you like her?" She said, "Yeah, she's really cool." This is not a relationship issue. Don't shy away from those direct questions about self-harm and suicide, because you might just save a life. 10% of people with this diagnosis are thought to complete suicide. And if they aren't asking for help, or the right sort of help, then it is up to us to be asking those questions. One of the things that was really helpful for me was Frankel's logotherapy, logo meaning, finding meaning in your life. But Frankel's quite a tough old guy. He's a Holocaust survivor. And his sort of central premise is to ask the person, what's got meaning for you? What are you doing to get more of that in your life? What else could you be doing? It's quite challenging. If you're going to be asking people those questions, then you need to be doing it in the spirit of those core conditions of empathy, congruence and unconditional positive regard, if they're going to be useful for the person that you're trying to help. So what helped for me? Well, I started taking responsibility for my actions precisely because my distress was being validated. Somebody said, "I see you. I see what's going on for you. I can see your pain." Again, that was a big moment in my life. And what that did was it allowed me to start trying to make a difference in my life, trying to do things differently to get something else. I started off with the really well-known therapeutic intervention of the car boot sale. And I took a stepped care approach to my recovery. I started going as a seller, challenged myself, stay there for 20 minutes, don't speak to anybody, it's fine. I got quite good at that. I developed what Marshall Linehan would call mastery. So I started going there and I had to ask 2 people how much something was. Just 2 people. So I've never carried so much cash in my life as I did at that time. I was terrified that I would have £3 in my pocket and somebody would say £4. That would have been catastrophic to me at the time. But I got good at it. I started going as a seller. Eventually I bought a generator, I hired a shipping container, I started sanding down furniture and selling it on Facebook. I opened a bee sanctuary a bit further on. Now, I don't believe that there was ever a clinicians meeting where those guys sat around a table and went, "Peter's doing all right at car boot sales. I think bee sanctuary's next on her list." You know, that didn't happen. So if you are going to take this values-based approach to helping, don't assume that you know what somebody's life worth living might look like. Excuse me. Talk to them in open dialogic spaces. Help them identify those sorts of things. My therapist firmly felt that I was the expert on me. And to his credit, it took him a couple of years, but he convinced me of that in the end. It was him that encouraged me to go into nursing. And as I've said, that first placement really encouraged me to be quite open about my mental health because I was kind of outed before I'd even got there. And despite all of that stuff, I'm not stood here today in front of you saying fixed, ta-da, all better now. Where you or I sit on that spectrum depends. It depends daily, and it depends on things like our stress in that moment and our vulnerability to that stress in that moment. Some days we are going to be on fire. Other days and other moments, less so. But Pat Deegan says that's grand. It's about embracing our very human fallibility. It's not about becoming normal. For all of us, if we want to improve our position on that spectrum, Ryle says, it's about bringing those behaviour patterns to awareness so that we can decide to do things differently. It's about having Linehan's willingness to approach that idea, because if we always do what we've always done and we don't like what we've always got as a result of that, then perhaps we will have the willingness to make changes, to try and do something different. It's about finding the bridges that connect us instead of the walls that divide. And you really don't have to be a therapist to see that as a rationale to work towards. But for the message to be heard, it must be delivered with Roger's empathy, congruence and unconditional positive regard, with Linehan's loving kindness, with Barker's person-centeredness and Deegan's humanness. Because as I said at the beginning of this presentation, much of our success with this group of people is going to come down to our attitude. And that in mind, I'm going to close with this quote, which has been attributed to Thich Nhat Hanh on empathy. And he said, when you plant lettuce, if it doesn't grow, you don't blame the lettuce. You look for the reasons it's not doing well. Might need fertiliser, more water or less sun. But you never blame the lettuce. Thank you guys.